Welcome back to another video and another fail by someone on antinatalism. So recently, or somewhat recently, there was a Christian pastor who put out a video about antinatalism, talking about how it's dangerous and he has a lot of misconceptions around it. So we're going to dive into the video. But before we do that, I just want to say I'm not responding to everything he says in the video. Sometimes he repeats himself, goes off on tangents. If you want to see the whole thing, look at the link in the description. But without further ado, let's get into it.
Antinatalism is a perspective, a position that has gained not a huge following, but a significant following around the world. It is made up of people who hold a position that believes that in order to end human suffering, that's their stated goal.
Okay, so straight off the bat, the first thing to say here is antinatalism doesn't have a goal. And antinatalists themselves as people aren't all the same, so they aren't going to have the same goal. Some antinatalists may want to end human suffering, and antinatalism might be part of that. But to conflate the two things is misleading. Antinatalism is simply the view that it's morally wrong to create new sentient beings. Now, holding that position is very likely motivated by the suffering that would be imposed on the new being, but to extract this to where this guy is just confused. For example, someone can be against murder because they believe it's wrong to unnecessarily kill people. And part of why they believe that is because they think it's wrong to impose unnecessary suffering on people. That doesn't mean that someone who's opposed to murder has the end goal of ending all human suffering. They might have a wider goal of ending all human suffering, and being opposed to murder might be part of that, but to conflate the two things is confused.
In order to end human suffering, we must prohibit procreation. In other words, we need to stop having human beings born because human beings are inevitably born into suffering. The odds of life being positive, upbeat, hopeful are in their minds so small, so minuscule that the risk of suffering and pain means that the better choice is to not be born at all.
So there are a couple things to say here. The first thing to say is that there's a difference between life being miserable and it being better to have never been born at all. And that can be because someone has what we generally all consider to be a good life, but they wouldn't have been deprived of those goods had they not been created, because they wouldn't exist to be deprived and that be a bad thing. But in their non-existence, they would also not have come into existence to experience the bad things that had happened in their life. And the second slightly separate thing is the way that this guy is implying that antinatalists think that people just have miserable lives and everything in life is bad. That isn't the case. Now, I do believe that our lives are much worse than people tend to give credit for, and if you want to find out why, you can watch my video, Why Life is Worse Than You Think. But that doesn't mean that our lives are miserable all of the time. Our lives might be very bad, but we can and do adapt to that situation. The bad in our lives can also be concentrated into specific periods such that the other periods of our life are actually pleasant, or at least mediocre. So yeah, antinatalists generally tend to view life as bad, but that doesn't mean that it's equally bad all of the time. It's not worth starting any given life, but once a life exists, it can be worth continuing at many points in our lives. You can be relatively upbeat day to day, but recognize intellectually that life is overall bad and that we shouldn't impose it on someone else.
The antinatalist movement is this idea that because of climate disaster propaganda, because of a 24-hour news cycle that seems to highlight global suffering in a nonstop onslaught to your mind, these people have determined that human suffering is the overarching reality of the human condition.
Antinatalism isn't just about concerns around the climate. Concerns around the climate do factor in for many antinatalists. But even if you remove concerns about the climate, the same fundamental points apply. Creating someone is morally wrong because it imposes significant amounts of harm without consent on them, and you leave them vulnerable to experiencing intense suffering. This is true with or without climate change. He also seems to imply that suffering is not an overarching reality of the human condition. But if it isn't, what are we to take from history? Suffering is part of our basic biological motivation system. We pursue things to avoid suffering. The most fundamental things like water to drink and shelter to get under. These are all motivated by avoiding suffering and deprivation. Think of all the disease, infant mortality, war throughout history. Of course, pleasures exist in life, but suffering has been much more dominant and is generally much more important than pleasure, as in avoiding suffering is much more important than gaining pleasure. I can't go into a whole defense of that that statement now, but I'll probably do another video on it. But anyway, for more on suffering and how it pervades our lives, again, you can check out my video, Why Our Lives Are Worse Than We Think.
There are three main arguments used in antinatalism. One is what Benatar, in his initial book, calls Axiological Asymmetry. Now, that's just a fancy philosophical term, which posits the idea that the experience of pain tips the scales in favor of never being born. In other words, you weigh the cost-benefit analysis of life versus non-life, and the suffering inherent in life gives the win to non-life as the best option.
I can understand what he's getting at here, but this is probably the first time he's engaging with this topic, and so it's natural that someone for the first time engaging with the topic is probably going to misrepresent it. But this isn't what the axiological asymmetry argument says. I'm not going to go into it fully here because that would just be a side tangent, and I'm probably going to do a full video on that argument in and of itself. But just to say here, it isn't about weighing up the goods and the bads. The axiological asymmetry posits that we value goods and bads differently with respect to bringing someone into existence. If accepted, it results in the evaluation that coming into existence is a harm. Benatar then goes on to use the quality of life argument to show the magnitude of the harm that it is and why that renders it immoral to create someone. If you want to go into the axiological asymmetry in more detail, you should really read Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been. And again, like I said, I will do a full video on it in the future, but I don't know when that's going to be. His book is linked in the description.
The other two arguments boil down to essentially consent and risk. Think about these sayings. We say that if sex without consent is rape, if work without consent is slavery, the antinatalists then make the leap that says birth without consent is an equal injustice. Now, how you gain consent for birth from somebody who's not yet been conceived is an intellectual black hole that nobody in that movement ever tries to deal with.
I'll deal with the last thing first. So he kind of dismisses this whole thing of like, well, how can you gain consent from someone to bring them into existence? Which, like, yeah, that's the argument. That's the whole point. The fact that there is no avenue available to you to gain consent to impose a significant amount of harm and death on someone, that's the whole point. That's why we should err on the side of non-action, especially given it's not about avoiding this person coming to greater harm. If there's someone unconscious and you can't wake them up, you can't then just do any sexual activity with them that you want. But if someone was unconscious and you can't wake them up and you see a car coming towards them, you should pick them up because it's avoiding greater harm. You wouldn't just say, oh, well, how are you supposed to gain consent? And then go ahead and do whatever sexual activity you want with their body. But anyway, going back to the first thing he said about rape and slavery being equal in justice to coming into existence, let's say a few things on this. So antinatalism doesn't say that the injustice of being raped or being a slave is equal to the harm imposed on someone through bringing them into existence. How bad it is going to be to create someone can only really be examined in reality in a prospective sense before you've created the person. And so you're really going off educated guesses about the harms that person is going to experience in their life. Again, if you want to get into the details of some of the harms that are reasonable to expect someone to go through in their life, you can check out my video, Why Our Lives Are Worse Than We Think. But suffice to say, any sober assessment of the harms that anyone born into this world will suffer is going to render an answer that they are significant. And two of those harms and injustices might be rape and slavery. And any prospect of that actually happening to the person should be incorporated into the evaluation. Really though, to know how bad creating any specific person actually is, you'd have to wait until the person has lived their whole life. And obviously that's not practical. And even then, just because our epistemic ability is not going to be perfect, we wouldn't fully know how bad it was to create them. But if we were able to do that and that life had contained periods of being a slave or instances of being raped, then the badness of those things would be factored into how bad it was to create someone. And in those cases, the harm would be equal to or greater than those specific bads.
Their argument is simply that we decide for the babies that for them to never exist as human beings is in their best interest. Without jumping straight to theology, it seems like the basic premise of antinatalism is essentially a God complex to make decisions about the very possibility for the existence of life.
So it isn't antinatalists that have a God complex. Anyone who is fertile will have to make the decision as to whether they're going to procreate or not. And that is making a decision over whether you're going to create someone or not. But also, how could an antinatalist play God in any meaningful sense? If you decide not to procreate, there is no one to play God with. We have no well-informed reason to think that someone exists before they are created via procreation. Creating someone, on the other hand, is literally the largest decision you can make for someone else. And you don't even have the ability to seek consent from them. And it imposes a significant amount of harm and the risk of extraordinary harm. All because in most cases, parents just wanted to create that person. This seems more like playing God than simply not creating someone.
Now, I've run into this a little bit, even in Christian circles, with people who say, well, you know, the world is such a horrible place and there's such terrible things. I mean, isn't it better to not subject a child to the kinds of things that we have in the world? It's just not, it's not safe, it's not right, it's not good. You see, what I want you to know is even though you've never heard of the antinatalist movement, the ideas are infiltrating even Christian circles because they're perpetuated as sort of a kind of bottom line compassion that just wants to avoid suffering in any way possible.
The idea that antinatalism is infiltrating Christianity, and it's not just a quite natural thought that comes up from some readings of some of the scriptures, is just mistaken. And actually, I've done a video responding to another Christian who was talking about antinatalism infiltrating the Christian church. I've linked that in the description. But before I go on and say a few things on this, I just want to say I'm no expert on the intersection between Christianity and antinatalism. If you know more than me, then please leave your thoughts in the description below. The first thing to say is just a pointer to places where you can learn a bit more about the intersection between Christianity and antinatalism. The first is the book by Théophile de Garreau, The Child-Free Christ. The second is a book or a PDF booklet called No Baby, No Cry, Christian Antinatalism by Martin Smith. And there's also even a Christian antinatalist Facebook group. I've linked all of those in the description below. I am yet to fully explore this topic, so I can't speak to the quality of any of those resources, but you can dive into them for yourself. You can also find passages in the Bible itself which seem to be making pronouncements that are at least friendly to something resembling antinatalism. For example, this passage from Ecclesiastes: "Wherefore I praise the dead that have been long dead more than the living that are yet alive. Yea, a better than them both did I esteem him that hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." And there have also been many Christian Gnostic sects throughout history that have been antinatalist as well. In fact, much of the antinatalism or proto-antinatalism that has existed throughout history has been religious and much of it Christian. It's also something that, given a Christian worldview, could be reasonably considered. After all, we are fallen beings in a fallen world. We are sinners. Why would someone want to create someone into a fallen world? Create someone into sin who cannot help but be a sinner. Also, if hell exists, why would you want to create someone who could eventually end up in hell? And I found a very short blog post on that specific argument that I'll link in the description. These are serious things for Christians to consider, not something that should just be dismissed as antinatalism is infiltrating the church from outside. These are natural questions that arise from the Christian worldview itself.
The quote from one of the writers said, "If there is no God, then there really is no reason to keep bringing new people here." All right, that's the foundational premise. There is no God, so what's the point? The Bible is very clear that it's a fool who has said in his heart that there is no God. But if you go to that foolish position and deny what Romans 1 tells us is the reality of the existence of God that's been implanted in the hearts of human beings, I mean, even when we deny it, we know it. Deep down, we know this is not accidental. This is too complex to be random. We know that there is a God. Deny it, say you don't believe it all you want to, and yet you still function as though there's meaning and reason. There is nobody, even those who philosophically argue that human life is pointless and has no significance whatsoever. That is not a worldview you can actually live your life by. I mean, suicide is the only appropriate response to a truly, utterly, absolutely meaningless existence. If you haven't committed suicide, then you are not living that worldview. Why? Because implanted in your brain, in your heart, is an underlying understanding that there is meaning somewhere. Maybe you haven't discovered it, maybe you haven't identified it, but this life can't be utterly pointless.
Now, this bit isn't really specifically about antinatalism. It's more about the difference between value and having cosmic meaning, but there's a couple things I want to say on here. This guy seems to be saying that if there is no ultimate meaning behind the existence of the universe, and by extension the existence of sentient life or human life, then there can be no value in continuing to exist. And so since you're continuing to exist, you obviously act as if there were meaning behind the universe. And, then he goes on to extrapolate that there must be a God. But this fails to appreciate the relationship between wanting to continue to exist and meaning, and also just different types of meaning and purpose. Someone can derive a sense of meaning and purpose in their life from a cosmic level, but you can also derive it from other levels. You can derive it from a local level based on the relationships that you have, or the community that you're a part of, or the positive contributions you make to wider society, or on an individual level in the pursuit of some goal or the pursuit of some passion or love, like writing or reading. You can recognize that there is no good reason to think there is a grand purpose to the universe, or humans existing for that matter, and think that we're here probably because of blind natural processes. And at the same time recognize that we're here, we're sentient beings and sapient beings, and as individuals we can value certain things like relationships or projects or just simply the pleasures in life, and choose to continue to exist to pursue those things. You don't need the belief that there is a grand purpose to the universe or that there is a God to pursue any of those things and have what you feel is a meaningful existence.
I would say that related to this idea of not bringing life into existence at all is related to the worldview that produces abortion. Abortion is simply legalized infanticide. In other words, it's taking a baby who happens to be not yet located outside of the womb, but still is no less a human being, and making it legal to kill that child. The infanticide that is abortion is related to this idea that inconvenience and suffering is to be avoided at all costs because there's no meaning and there's no purpose ultimately. So the best we can do is sort of try and get by with the least amount of trouble possible.
The first thing to say is the fact that this guy thinks that antinatalism and being pro-abortion are derived from the same worldview just shows how much of a misunderstanding he has of antinatalism. Antinatalism doesn't prescribe any specific view on abortion. In fact, I'm putting up on screen a document that I've linked in the description that documents a debate on abortion between two prominent antinatalists. Antinatalism pertains to the bringing into existence of lives, but depending on when you think a life has been brought into existence is going to determine how antinatalism relates to your view on abortion. For example, if someone believes that you come into existence in a morally relevant sense at conception, then a being already exists from the point of conception, and so abortion is killing a being, not stopping them from coming into existence. And so antinatalism wouldn't be relevant here. It would only be relevant in preventing conception from happening. And there are antinatalists that hold this view. But you could also be an antinatalist that thinks that a being comes into existence in the morally relevant way when sentience arises. In that case, abortion would be good before sentience arises because you're preventing a being from coming into existence, and that's what antinatalism is all about. But once sentience arises, then it becomes much more complicated and you're killing a being rather than preventing it from coming into existence. At this point, antinatalism has nothing to say on this. So saying that being antinatalist and being pro-abortion are derived from the same worldview is a misunderstanding, because the more important view determining your view on abortion is when you think a being has come into existence in a morally relevant way.
And the antinatalist movement, the abortion movement, and the euthanasia movement all say the same thing. Human life is not good. It can be disposed of at any stage so long as it's convenient to the rest of us.
Okay, so I'm not going to argue the abortion point or the euthanasia point because this is a video about antinatalism, but I think both of those points are largely misguided. On antinatalism though, not creating a life is not disposing of a life. A life has to exist to be disposed of, and he's kind of vague about what he means when he says human life is bad. That could mean human life is poor quality, and in that case most antinatalists would probably agree, but it can also mean that human life is bad in some sort of external malicious malicious way, that it is some sort of negative force in the universe or on our planet. Humans do cause a lot of harm in the way that we currently live, and some of that harm is probably unavoidable in any way that we lived. But this doesn't mean that humans are necessarily a plague on this earth or intrinsically bad and should be disposed of. If anything, antinatalism has a premise that human life is of moral concern. That is why antinatalists don't want to create it. But if it is created, obviously it should still be cared for. How that care might look will be different to different people who have different views, but in no way does being antinatalist mean that you think human life is disposable. Anyway, let me know what you thought of the pastor's thoughts and views and understanding or misunderstanding of antinatalism. Let me know what you thought of my reaction to him, and I'll see you in the next one.